2, 1. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here as our CARES Act Oversight Committee. And we do have 2 guests with us today, so I thought if you all don't mind, we'll do an introduction of our committee members. And then we will, just a few minutes down in the agenda, get to our guests also. But I thought we would go ahead and start. Again, I am Mary Jo Wiggins. I'm the Finance Deputy Director, and I've been helping the administration coordinate all of our different federal funding. And I'm grateful for you all participating in this. Ashley?
Ashley Warrington, Mayor's Office.
Alex Dickerson, Metro Legal.
Sean Henry, Nashville Predators.
Sarah Finley, Threshold Corporate Consulting.
Vonda McDaniel, Central Labor Council of Nashville and Middle Tennessee.
Courtney Johnston, Metro Council member for District 26.
Jennifer Gamble, Metro Council member, District 3.
Sandra Sepulveda, Metro Council, District 30.
Renato DeBecco, lawyer with Bradley A. Rand, Bolt Cummings.
Edward Henley, Village Development.
Thank you. And together we have from Equity Alliance, Charlene Oliver, and from United Way, Erica Mitchell, and they will be sharing some of their information that they have been discovering and gathering in some of our community work. So we'll get to that. I wanted to actually ask Alex to give us kind of our rules as we're going to start getting into decision making and preparing an interim proposal on some of the decision making and rules.
Just a brief word. So many of you have a pretty good understanding of parliamentary procedure. If you're on Metro Council, you probably have an ad nauseum understanding of this. We will not be doing anything nearly as complicated. It usually helps when you have a small body of 9 members. Things can be done a little bit more amicably. Much of what you do will be informal discussions, but that don't require any real procedure to have. However, you have at least one formal task, which is to make recommendations, and that will need to be voted on. So I wanted to just kind of briefly go over that. Basically, what sets out your requirements for parliamentary procedure is often set by the ordinance itself. In this case, the ordinance doesn't require anything specifically. There's also there are a few Metro Code provisions that apply to boards and commissions generally. Most of them don't apply to you, and there's no real state statute. So there's not an existing set of rules that you have to follow. Normally, if this was a board or commission or task force that was going to meet for an indefinite amount of time, I'd recommend that you adopt some formal bylaws or rules. However, because you all have kind of an end date and you're meeting relatively infrequently compared to long-term boards and commissions, normally you default to what's called Robert's Rules of Order, general stuff that you all know from ever being on a nonprofit board. The book itself is this thick, but I promise you we will be doing less than 1 page worth of material for it. A couple key points. One is quorum. In order to conduct any business and have any vote, you have to have a majority of those on the committee present. In this case, it would be 5. You all are well over that today, so you could conduct any motions that you needed to. If for some reason we have less than quorum, you can have discussions, you simply can't vote on anything. So that's obviously not an issue today, but just something to be aware of going forward. For voting, you have 3 possible votes. You can yes to the motion, no to the motion, or you may abstain from voting on the motion. To pass a vote, you need the default standard for Robert's Rules of Order is a majority of those present and voting. So for instance, if you had 6 people present, you would have your quorum, so you'd be allowed to vote. If one person abstained, to pass a vote, you would need a majority of the 5 people remaining. So you'd need 3 votes. So just an example, but that is the default standard for it. How to make a motion, pretty simple. Raise your hand or indicate to the moderator that you'd like to be called on. You then make a motion. I move that, blah, blah, blah. Someone will need to second the motion. If you're seconding a motion, that doesn't bind you to vote in favor of it. It just means that you believe that it should be discussed on the floor. At that point, there will be an open discussion time where you can have lots of back and forth discussions. If someone wants to make an amendment to the existing motion or ask a question of procedure, which is called a point of order, or call for the vote. It's called calling the question. Any of that can be done during the discussion period. If you want to be able to do something and you have a question about it, just ask me. I'll be here and we can talk through how to make that happen procedurally. And then you conduct the actual vote. Given the size of us, I would recommend voting by show of hands for yes, no, abstain, and then that way it can be appropriately recorded. Actually, I think you're doing the recording of the votes. So that way no one has to do complicated technology, which I think Metro Council members will tell you that sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. Okay, so that's the general stuff for parliamentary procedure. I also have a quick statement I want to make about ethics. I've passed out just the general Metro Code standards, Chapter 2.222 for standards of conduct. Something to be aware of, a lot of this speaks in terms of employee, and you all are not employees in the labor and employment sense of the word, but you are employees for purposes of ethics. So just something to be aware of. There's a lot of description on here, especially 2.222.020 on the second page. Just describes the shells and shall nots for being a, quote unquote employee for Metro. So a lot of you may have questions about, hey, I might have some type of material financial interest in an entity that may receive money as a result of CARES funding. I don't represent any of you in your individual capacities, and so if you want to seek your advice of your own attorney, you may do so. But I will say, generally speaking, if there's a material effect or if there's an appearance of impropriety, I just recommend generally that you abstain from the vote. And that should be pretty easy to do. If you have questions about something specifically, feel free to come ask me. I just like to make sure you understand the caveat that I don't represent you, but I'm happy to give you my 2 cents as someone who's trained in the law. So with that, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Ashley, I'm going to ask if you will review the legislative updates. One of the things that we did send you was just a summary. We debated how many pages of Senate and House proposed bills you were interested in, and boil it down to a one-page summary. And Ashley's been working closely to try to get the most up-to-date information, because there is current legislation that could impact. Some of it could be dramatic, some of it might be dates that will impact some of our decisions. So, Ashley?
Sure. So the biggest thing is the expected timing, because I know you guys want to be able to take that into consideration as you're making your own decisions. We've been advised by numerous lobbyists that work in Washington, D.C., that the earliest the vote could happen would be August 7th, and even that's not likely. And so there's a Senate version, a House version, and the Senate version is comprised of about 3 or 4 different bills already. So right here is just the highlights for you guys. So key components is new money for state and local. The House version included $1 billion of it, and the Senate version did not include any. And so that's likely that when they go into conference and have their debates, that we will actually get some money, but we don't know how much. We don't know what restrictions will be put on it, and we don't know the timing of when we'll be able to actually have that money. The other key component is the extended spending deadline. Senate version gave us till moved from December 30th to September 2021, which would be great instead of the deadline that we're all facing right now. That is likely to survive, but again, there's no guarantee for when that is. That was in the Senate version, not the House. And then the flexibility of spending funds. This was again in the Senate version. And if you've read the news, you can see where there's infighting within the Senate, and so you don't know which one's actually going to pass. So it would allow us to use up to 25% for losses, as long as we can show that at least that much was in revenue shortfall. So as you can see, that's probably not wise to bank on anything for the federal government as you guys are making decisions, because we don't know when the timing will be for when that would even take effect or how that will impact us.
Councilmember Johnston?
Is that for the new money that would be appropriated with this, or would it go retroactive to the $121 million that we have now?
So the deadline for spending would be retroactive,
Okay.
and the flexibility would be retroactive.
Okay.
That's a really good question.
Excellent. So today we will primarily work through that framework, and what you have in front of you is similar to what you saw at our last meeting. We did kind of reorganize it a little bit. There were some additional requests from departments, and we heard from a few other external parties, and we'll go through that. The second version you have of that is really just more a question summary for you to start thinking about the questions that you'll need to answer as far as making your recommendations. And the two guests that we asked to join us today, we do know that a lot of the requests and what you probably are hearing quite a bit from the community is what is the need, and how have different the zip codes that have been heavily impacted by the COVID health crisis, but also the economic crisis. And so how have they all been impacted? And so we'll have our guests speak in case they need to leave. They are welcome to stay. But you probably have heard Metro did invest into a contract with Equity Alliance, and Charlene Oliver is here, and we're going to have her give a preliminary report in what they are finding through their canvassing and surveys. And Erica Mitchell is here because United Way of Greater Nashville, through private donations, and it was not any part of the federal funding, raised $5 million and has dispersed all of those funds and has been reviewing applications and hearing from the nonprofits and hearing from those. And so they could also tell us what they've seen over the past 4 to 5 months in relief. So we'll start with Charlene. Thank you.
And I'll turn your mic on for you. I need one of those boxes back when
For sure.
Hey, Charlene, if you'll go to your desk, or yeah, because you can.
You'll need the microphone.
Testing? There we go. One, two, three. Okay. All right. All righty. So for those who don't know, the Equity Alliance, we're a 501c3 nonprofit in Nashville that really focuses on advocacy for the African American community around issues related to civic engagement as well as systemic oppression. And we advocate for a fair and just America for marginalized communities. We've been around for about 4 years, and we've been tasked with doing this needs assessment for Mayor Cooper and Metro Council. We launched this campaign about 2 weeks ago, and it's called Our Fair Share, and with the idea in mind that as federal stimulus money rolls down the pipeline to cities from the federal government, that the communities that are hit the hardest get their fair share of the funding and we put those dollars directly into the hands of the people. That's what we believe needs to happen. We know that before we did this needs assessment, folks in Black and brown communities and working class communities were really dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. So I wanted to give some background and context. I'm on the page 3 here around where we are before we entered this needs assessment. As of today, we have a little over 20,000 confirmed cases in Nashville, and we know that the infection rates have been the highest in communities of color. What we did was focus on the top 12 zip codes that have the COVID hotspots. So that's how we drilled down, because we know that we can't fully assess all of Davidson County in a matter of weeks. So we wanted to bring some rationale around how we got to target the people that we need to assess. Also, we need to keep in mind that prior to the pandemic, we had layers of distress by Nashvillians, especially people of color, who are experiencing during this pandemic. Metro Social Services put out a report several months ago stating that people of color, particularly Black Nashvillians, are already living in generational poverty. And then on March 3rd, the tornadoes ripped through North Nashville, and shortly after that, the pandemic struck, exacerbating and disrupting life as we know it. Amid all of this, even during the pandemic, protests broke out all across the U.S. and even here in Nashville, folks calling for change and for Black lives to finally matter. As supplemental unemployment insurance expires as of, I believe, today, and the threat of evictions looms large, it's beyond critical that you do everything possible to ensure that relief is given in a manner that is a direct, immediate positive effect on dire situations many of our fellow Nashvillians are trying to desperately overcome. So in our assessment, we can't afford to let these funds be spent in ways that don't directly help people who are getting hurt by the pandemic. So our approach to this needs assessment, again, we wanted to drill down in vulnerable populations, particularly African American and Latino communities living in the top 12 zip codes with the highest cases of COVID. We also wanted to survey minority-owned businesses in those areas. When we pulled the numbers, there are about 62,000 households in these top 12 zip codes, and we wanted to get a 5% response rate. So our goal was to try to achieve a little over 3,000 surveys as a survey sample, as a solid data collection piece. I'm proud to say that we've reached a third of that goal already, and we are well on our way to reaching that goal. So we wanted to provide you with this preliminary information that we have. As you can see from page 7, the top 12 zip codes of COVID hotspots are roughly in Southeast Nashville and a little bit of East Nashville and some of North Nashville. And what we know is if we overlay that with our population data, those are also our marginalized and people of color communities. In those population zip codes, we have about in the population of Davidson County, we have, roughly 28% Black, 10% Hispanic, but in these 12 zip codes, they are more than that. So based on our key findings, I'm flipping through here because I think I was on a time limit. Kind of hard to hold a mic and flip the page. So based on our findings, we surveyed 1,028 adults in a matter of less than a week. From July 23rd to July 27th is when we conducted our initial survey. And we wanted to just achieve quantitative data. Our goal is to do the survey in 2 phases. One is to collect the quantitative data that will give us some just hard-line, top-line data. But as we roll into next week, we're going to start collecting qualitative data through our website and through canvassing operations and through our partner organizations. We've recruited over 27 partner organizations to help us distribute the survey in the community. As we can see, Nashvillians are struggling, and a vast majority of them are reporting that they have little to no say in government. And I wanted to lead with that because that was a striking number that we found, that 80% of survey respondents felt like they did not have a say in government. And as we're pushing out the survey, we're telling people that you do have a say. Take the survey to help people feel like they have input in their democracy. So I think that's important to keep in mind as we are distributing these funds, that people already feel like they can't trust government and they don't have a say. And so it's our opportunity to really show the community that we are listening. I'm on page 12 here, where it says Nashvillians are struggling to understand and participate in local government, limiting their access to COVID-19 protections and assistance, and creating confusion about how to navigate the pandemic. So what we see is that 49% of respondents are saying that they are getting confusing or contradicting information from their elected officials, whether that's federal, state, or local. And that number is even more higher than what people feel like is their biggest challenges is social isolation at 45%. Other challenges that they felt were very important was identifying reliable sources of information, as well as lacking supplies such as sanitizer and soap. Those were the highest challenges that people felt like were their biggest challenges during this pandemic. In terms of the impact of COVID, we know that this is impacting a lot of people negatively, and we saw that in the survey. 1 in 5 adults have either had their work hours reduced or they lost their jobs entirely as a result of the pandemic. Black and Latino residents report the most acute negative impacts. While 43% of all respondents say they need either financial assistance, rent assistance, or food assistance to quarantine safely, Black respondents and Latinx respondents in particular report a need for such assistance. And that need is greatest felt among the Black community at 51% of respondents and 49% of Latinx respondents, respectively. These communities are also being directly hit hardest by the virus. As we see, 14% of respondents and 27% of Latinx respondents say they have struggled with someone in their household getting sick from COVID-19, compared to just 9% of white respondents. In terms of assistance, very few Nashvillians actually know how to access the support that they need to make it through the pandemic. Respondents who actually don't know how to access the assistance, 60% say that food assistance is, they don't know how to access food assistance. 70% say they don't know how to access help with their utility bills or financial assistance. And then most strikingly, 84% say that they do not know how to access rent assistance. Now, when we drill down further into the 12 COVID hotspots, that number gets even larger. Financial assistance at 27% in the COVID hotspots, as well as utility assistance and then rent assistance of these people who don't know how to access assistance. Now, when we look at the data across race, when we compare residents of color to white respondents, white residents, there are some striking differences. In the 12 hardest hit zip codes, which on average are more diverse than the city as a whole, Nashvillians are experiencing disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 and report being more in need of assistance. Residents of color are more likely than white respondents to say they and their families have faced serious challenges. One of the biggest differences is here where residents of color, 45%, said that they lack critical supplies such as hand sanitizer and sanitizing wipes, versus 32% of white respondents. Additionally, residents of color report being in need of assistance at a higher rate than white respondents. Financial assistance was the greatest need that people felt like they needed. 39% of residents of color reported that financial assistance was their greatest need, followed behind rent assistance and access to the internet. It's also interesting that virtual learning assistance was also selected among residents of color, with a striking contrast to white respondents, 12% versus 3%. Now, residents of hotspot zip codes report more need for assistance than Nashville as a whole when you compare zip code hotspots versus just the entire Davidson County. 38% of residents in COVID hotspots report needing financial assistance, rent assistance, food assistance, and energy assistance, more than the population as a whole.
Financial assistance and rent assistance, it seems like those could overlap. Was there a definition sort of to make those distinct, just so that we kind of know exactly what someone meant when they said financial assistance?
I am not sure. I would have to check with the surveyor who did it, but I would imagine that financial assistance would mean just a regular, just cash payment versus actually help with paying a bill. If that makes sense.
And Charlene, if I may ask, just for time, maybe to do a higher level through the rest of it,
Okay.
so that we don't go page by page.
Sure.
It's good that we have it.
Skipping to the public response, what you need to know here is that residents reported that they would like to see the funds used on mortgage and rent relief. 35% of respondents say that, followed behind 23% of respondents say they would like to see small grants for businesses, grants for small businesses used. And I'd like to note that rent relief and mortgage relief was the greatest need versus the greatest thing that people said they didn't know how to access. So. Moving on to the business portion. So we did a separate business survey for respondents. Obviously, the questions would be different. And we surveyed 58 businesses so far, primarily African-American businesses within the age range of 35 to 45 was our biggest spread of folks questioned. And in those surveys, we got data collected from the top 5 zip codes. What you need to know here is that most businesses anticipate being able to sustain their business 2 to 5 months, followed by 6 months. Cash flow was a huge barrier and challenge right now for respondents. 60% of business owners of color received no form of income assistance during the pandemic versus our white business owners, 38% versus 60%. The top 3 challenges that business owners felt that they were facing: generating revenue. 72% of respondents said generating revenue was their biggest challenge, followed by a decline in business and paying their bills.
Around, did the African-American businesses and minority businesses, did they apply for relief and were denied, or did they not know how to access what was available?
A combination of both. In some of the anecdotal data that we got, some did apply for state funding as well as the EDIL and PPP funding, but were denied. But then some just didn't know how to access it or didn't have that relationship.
You said most businesses can survive 2 to 5 months, and the greatest is 6 months. Was that in total, or is that moving forward from the survey point?
And say that again. Oh, okay.
You stated that most businesses could survive 2 to 5 months. Mm-hmm. Was that in total, so going back to March 15th or so? Or was that 2 to 5 months moving forward from the point of the survey, so late July moving forward?
Moving forward, yes.
Thank you.
That pretty much concludes my report. The last 3 pages just give some quotes that we received from the survey respondents for businesses. That gives you sort of some colored data around what they were facing, some of those challenges. And
Sure.
Any questions? Other questions?
I just want to thank you for pulling this all together so quickly. Really, from the time that you've launched the survey, you all have really been getting to quite a few of our residents and reporting back to us. And we certainly look forward to the full report of the data. And then also, Charlene has explained that the qualitative of really why some of these issues are present and how best to, address them. So again, thank you for really quickly pulling together some of the early data for this committee to hear and understand. We appreciate that.
Problem. Thank you.
And then I do want to actually ask Erica Mitchell with United Way to talk a little bit about what they've seen over the past 4 to 5 months as they have distributed funds that were raised by the organization.
Sure, thanks Mary Jo, and thank you everyone for having me today. So the United Way COVID Response Fund was established toward the end of March in conjunction with the Mayor's Office and other philanthropic leaders and business leaders in the community. And as Mary Jo indicated at the beginning of the meeting, right at just over $5.1 million raised and distributed in about 15 weeks. We made our last round of distributions about 2 weeks ago, and that final round because it was the final sort of exhaustion of the fund. What we saw initially was that, not surprisingly, there was a great deal of fear. And there was a great deal of fear around potentially being evicted, losing your place of employment. Losing your home. So the first couple of rounds of funding were dedicated to keeping people in their homes. So it was very much to rent and mortgage assistance, utilities, food security. It was the basic needs. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it was very much meeting the basic needs to keep people in their homes. As the time went on, what we saw was an expansion of what that need looked like. So we started investing in things like mental health services, and that was for youth as well as for adults, domestic violence. A lot of help around food security, which continued to surge. We were able to partner with Vanderbilt Meharry to get some data in conjunction with 211 so that we could see what some of those spikes look like. And we followed that so that we could make investments where we saw the most needs. So expanding again, looking at basic needs as well as going to mental health services, education services, et cetera. What we began to see over time was that, it speaks a little bit to Charlene's point, and what we were seeing was that there were a number of communities that were being hard hit. We saw the hot spots, as we were calling them, a lot of essential workers who were having higher contact, and as a result, creating in these concentrated areas of COVID. And many of these folks were not able to stop work as a result of, which continued some of the spread. But many of those communities, although some were accessing services, we did discover, and not surprisingly again, if there is not a trust, if there's not a relationship that you have established, many folks are not comfortable going to some of the readily available services where you were able to receive rent and mortgage assistance, food assistance, et cetera, but they would trust someone from their community. So we started looking to more grassroots organizations to provide funding at that level so that we could see more assistance being provided to those communities where there were greater areas of need. One of the things that was very beneficial to us, we had a report called Charity Tracker, and it's really a shared database. And that shared database was shared across our financial assistance network. So there were about six, maybe I think we ended up with about 9 organizations that were participating on Charity Tracker, and it gave us a good amount of data. It gave us the number, the dollar amount that was actually going out. It gave us demographic data, zip code data, and we were actually able to see and kind of drill down. Some of the things that are interesting from that, to date, we've seen about $1.7 million go out in financial assistance. What's interesting around that is if you look at the zip codes that are represented here in those hotspots, those are the zip codes where we saw the vast majority of those funds going, with 37013, 37211, and 115 being the highest distribution zip codes. What we also saw is that, perhaps not surprisingly, female-headed households were 2 to 1 the recipients of funds. The other piece is that I'm thinking about, we're just beginning to think about what's happening in the environment right now. So those funds have gone out the door. As I said, the fund itself has been exhausted. We do know that there's a good amount of funding that's coming into the community now. So we know the state has $150 million that will, $150 million in CARES money that will go across the state. So there'll be a distribution there. Very specifically focused in on rent and mortgage assistance, you have MDHA that just recently released their RFP, so $3.3 million, specifically targeting rent mortgage assistance. They do put a cap on, it's $1,400 max, but that is specific to rent and mortgage assistance. And then you also have Metro Action Commission, and I believe that number is $1.8 million targeted toward rent mortgage assistance. So there are dollars that have been made available. There are questions you have to ask about that. And again, I think it comes down to, we know that there is this concentrated amount of money going toward a very specific focus. It has to be expended in a short amount of time. It's that condensed time frame. We don't know if it's going to be extended or not by Congress. Right now, those dollars have to be expended by the end of December. You have to ask questions about, again, is there a trust factor for folks to be able to receive those funds depending upon where they are made available? So I think that is one question. I think we will continue to see need in our hotspots. There is a general distrust of government in many of our hotspot areas. And so there would not necessarily be folks who would clamor at the opportunity, for example, to apply to Metro Action Commission for help. So I think we have to be aware of those sorts of things. Something else that I think we should consider is the pandemic will not end on December the 31st. And so what happens on January 1? And is there a way, with so much financial resource coming into the community at one time, and again, you have the pressure of the requirement to spend down funds by X date. Is there a way in which funds can be preserved heading into January, because we know that the pandemic is not going to end? Perhaps there will be additional federal funding that comes available. We don't know that for sure. I would think, but we don't know that for sure. Is there a way to create savings that would allow for funds to be available at the top of the year? And I just think that's something to consider as well. Another consideration, I think there are a lot of thoughts around right now, but kind of the hot topic is around childcare. I do not know, unfortunately, I do not know the guidance around the dollars that have gone to Community Foundation that are specific to childcare. I believe the number is right around 26 million, but I don't know the guidance around how those funds are to be spent. That to me would speak to potentially the accessibility, the availability of high quality seats. I just got off a call earlier this morning about the rush for the need for additional childcare seats, and think childcare in an expanded way. It's not simply infants to pre-K. Now, because we have an asynchronous learning system for school, you need, as a parent, childcare all the time. So you will have school-age children who will need to have childcare while mom and dad go to work. There's a scramble right now as we look for where are the available seats, where are the buildings, how can we pay for this? So there's a question around that, and again, I don't know what's happening with the 26 million. It could be that those funds could be utilized for that purpose, or it could be that there's an opportunity with the funds you have charge of. So that's something else for consideration. Those are kind of the two main areas. I didn't preface my comments on rent and mortgage assistance knowing that we do have about 5.1 that's already been infused into the system. I do also want to add that it's really important to note many of the folks that we saw early on in the pandemic, they took advantage of forbearance and they took the deferred payments, and those are due. Typically it was about 3 months, some took advantage of up to 6, but those payments are literally due August 1. So that is definitely something to consider to keep people in their homes so that we don't see a spike and a rise in evictions. We do know that the unemployment rates continue to be high in the state as well as in Davidson County. So I'll stop there, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Partially a question for you. This amount that the state is allocating to nonprofits, the $150 million, and my understanding is there going to be administrators that can apply to oversee some of that allocation, and then individual grants to nonprofits. Do you have any sense of how and when we will know some of the parties and priorities involved in that, just for purposes of helping educate us on what's getting funded?
Sure. So there are $150 million in CARES funds that will be distributed across the state of Tennessee. There was an application process that started this past week. If there are organizations that were interested in applying to become a grant administrator, United Way did apply to become a grant administrator. I believe there should be some information in the next few days about what that looks like, because again, the timeline is ticking, right? These are funds that have to be expended by the end of the year. My impression, based on the application itself, is that there would be a small number of grant administrators, with the total dollar amount being $150 million across the state. One of the requirements was that the organization had to have the ability to distribute at least $30 million. So that would be grant administrator that would be responsible for a large amount of geography, so multiple counties. Again, what I would anticipate is that we would hear something in the next few days, because the funds themselves, by the timeline of the application, the funds themselves application would go live as soon as, or as early as next week. So there should be notice, maybe even as early as tomorrow.
Representative Love.
See if I can provide some other support to the response. We meet again, I think, August the 3rd at the state level. And one of our challenges was that we set aside a huge amount of money expecting and hoping that Congress would change their mind about whether we could use CARES Act money for revenue replacement. The problem is that when you tell states and localities to spend CARES Act money and not spend it on revenue replacement, you may have a state like Texas that does that, spends it on CARES, COVID response, and doesn't set aside money. But then when Tennessee does, it's unfair to Texas to then change middle of the road and say, oh, if you have set aside money, you can spend on revenue replacement. So Congress decided to just go ahead and go through what the original plan was to be fair to all states. As a result, now Tennessee has to find a way to spend that $1 billion that we set aside to then get out. So I think what you're going to probably find is that in addition to the $150 million for nonprofits, Memphis and Nashville specifically, when we put our plan together, may find ways that the state can help us with our planning process, because they also allocate, I think, $115 million to other states, other cities and counties that did not receive any money from the CARES Act directly. And so as we put our plan together, let's keep that in mind, that there may be opportunities for us to retain some more of our money if we see that the state's plan is going to take care of a lot of what we're trying to do, which is maybe rent relief, right? Maybe we can find a way to focus more on MDHA, THDA, if we had a certain amount of money set aside for that rent relief. I would imagine that there's going to be another round of nonprofit money come out after the $150 million, but this is probably just to see how the response is in the nonprofit arena and those who apply.
Is there a way that you could share that data that you were talking about specifically for Davidson County, so we could see the demographics and zip codes and just how it all went through and the number of families that were?
Absolutely. The charity tracker report, I can send that. Mary Jo, I'm glad to send that your direction if that helps.
Thank you.
And you can distribute to Shirley.
Follow up to Sarah's question to Charlene about the financial assistance. Do you all have a breakdown of what financial assistance covers and how different that is from rent assistance?
Yes, so what you'll find in the report is a breakdown. You'll have a total dollar amount that's been distributed. The most recent report that I have is through the end of June, but let me see. I can send that report. Or I can also see if I can get one actually through today. But it will give you a breakdown on the dollars that went specific to rent and mortgage, what went to utilities, what went to direct financial assistance. And we do ask, but those dollars are typically used for things like, it could be for food, it could be for diapers, it could be for any type of miscellaneous expense, but there is a breakdown on how the dollars are distributed.
I was wondering if it was used for utilities like phone, cell phone, or things like that, that may be not included in rent assistance, but definitely need to run the household.
Yes, you'll see the breakdown for utilities as well.
Erica, thank you for sharing that, and I will make sure that we send out the charity tracker data. So what I want to do is kind of move into the framework. I feel like we'll never have enough time for all of the discussion, but I think what was really helpful to hear is perhaps, and especially thank you again, Representative Love, that there's a great puzzle to put together with the funding that we have and the timing. And I think the timing is what's, we're anxious to get the money to the community, but we also know if we have to make it, if we end up having to make it last, you know, if we get the opportunity to actually make it last till September, or as Erica said, where is the need going to continue when the federal funding isn't there? So I did send last night guiding principles, and I just wanted to look at those quickly with you all from the perspective, I think it starts to, this was something that we really looked from an administrative side, from the administration. And it's a little bit of, if you want to know what we're thinking, as you all make your decisions, we really put them into, 4 components, which is really our public emergency response, and that we need to protect our community, from a public health perspective. And so a lot of our medical expenses are in there from our testing centers and our shelters, again, as well as PPE and sanitation of public buildings, and also the protection of our essential workers here within Metro government. We also want to make sure that our youth have the tools they need to ensure that their education continues through this pandemic. And we've made that $24 million commitment to MNPS, something that isn't within this $121 million, but Metro will also be filing a claim with FEMA, as it's a federal disaster. And so any of the expenses that we incur that are FEMA eligible, they have much stricter guidelines and requirements than this coronavirus relief fund does. But if anything that we can charge, essentially seek reimbursement from FEMA, we will be filing that claim. And so one of the ways we identified we could help MNPS was to include, because they are eligible under our filing, that any of the PPE and sanitization and the extra expenses that they will incur, if they are FEMA eligible, we will file those so they don't have to use their funding from the Education Stabilization Fund. So you see that. And then really we get into our final 2 categories that we've talked so much about, which is really the health and safety of our citizens, particularly our vulnerable and our essential workers. And that's through not only the financial support, also looking at some of the child care and mental health, and those are the other items that we're talking about with our population. And we also need, the last item is to reinforce the structure that binds us all as Nashvillians. And that's what makes Nashville, Nashville. That might be really in our businesses. We want to make sure that we continue to be an economic engine for the state. We are certainly driving a lot of the state revenues. We think that might be where the state might be interested in making some additional investments for us. But what can we do with the funds that we have? It might be restaurant and hospitality. It's our music venues. It's some of the locations that we all visit, not only as the tourists come in, but as Nashvillians. So that's in that small business area. So we sent that so that you kind of had an idea that we think those are the most important components, and we are asking you to help us fill in the blanks. So that goes back to the framework, and I'll walk through it a little bit. Yes. Oh, sorry. Councilmember Sepulveda.
I was just going to say, I mean, we just received this breakdown of what everyone's asking for specifically, and I feel like we will have many questions. So I don't feel comfortable making a decision today. And I think we need to have another meeting sooner rather than later with all of the departments coming in and answering our questions. So I don't know how the rest of the committee feels, but I personally would not be comfortable at this time.
Councilmember Johnston?
As far as the additional infrastructure that we have, this, a bunch of departments that have asked for certain things, I think that really needs to be looked at. I mean, I personally, and I'm all about public safety, but I've gotten multiple requests with multiple amounts that are continually rising, apparently. And I really just want to make sure that I think the biggest threat that COVID-19 poses is the long-term economic devastation for our businesses and our individuals. And so while I want to take care of our metro departments and make sure that we can take advantage of those funds, I really want to maximize what we can give to our small businesses and our individuals, because as we've seen, our sales tax revenue and activity tax revenue came in much higher than we thought. And the reason was because there was so much stimulus behind it. Those stimulus are not sustainable. And so as the United Way representative said, these people that have taken advantage of rent relief and mortgage relief, those things are coming due, and I think it's incredibly important to make sure that we can allocate funds in an efficient and quick way to keep people in their homes, because we're going to be looking at massive devastation when this comes to fruition. So I know that we have to come up with some sort of plan by September. I think that it would be my request of this committee to sort of fast track the supporting the health and economic welfare of individuals and fast track the reinforcing of infrastructure in Nashville and its economy by really looking at how much of this fund, these monies that we want to allocate to that, and figure out how pretty quickly, and maybe put on the back burner exactly what's going to go to these departmental things, because again, this isn't an emergency. It's an emergency when people are getting eviction notices, and it's an emergency when businesses are closing. So I also, to Council Lady Sepulveda's point, think that meeting twice, every 2 weeks, I don't think is enough. And I'd like to at least meet once a week to really get this right and get it done in a quick and efficient manner.
Excellent. Thank you. Go ahead.
One question I had, just kind of thinking about what's legally required of us. I guess the ordinance set forth that we have to make preliminary recommendations by August 3rd. And this might be a question for council. Is there any guidance on what those preliminary recommendations have to look like? How broad can they be to allow us to have the flexibility to fill in the blanks in a lot of the requests that I know everyone's been getting? So I guess, what in your opinion do we need to do to kind of meet our legal obligation as a committee while retaining flexibility to figure out the details?
I will say that's all set out in the ordinance. Let me pull up that language and see, but I know it was very broad. It wasn't very specific in what it required, so I'll take a look at that.
Go ahead, Councilmember Gamble.
I was just going to say, I agree with Councilwoman Johnson that we need to, if it's possible, to, while we're looking at the preliminary general spending category recommendation for August 3rd, can we also look at a recommendation for the rent relief and small business relief that we can present to the council, if not on the 3rd, by the 17th for review and a vote, like we did similar to the schools getting the computers, not wait until the end for those recommendations.
Excellent.
And I'll just say I'm just reading from the ordinance, it just says that the committee shall submit its initial recommendations to the mayor, director of finance, and the Metropolitan Council not later than August 3rd, and its final recommendation not later than November 15th. So all you have to submit is an initial recommendation. There's no guidelines as to what that is.
So, again, it could be as general as, we recommend we make, and I'm going to just put in numbers, please. This is not, this is, you fill in the blanks, but we want to give X million dollars to nonprofits, and we want a component of that to be specifically for, rent and mortgage, or we want it specifically to be to childcare, or you may not choose the specifics. And you may say, we want X amount to small businesses, and we want these distributions to be made within the X, amount of time. So it could look something like you're taking a piece of it for some immediate relief that you've heard today, from those that have been working in it to do that, and that your recommendation is to then hold back as you hear about what happens in the community, as we get final detail from Equity Alliance, as we hear about legislation changes. Is that consistent?
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and point out too that, it says initial recommendations and then final recommendations. I don't think there's anything that legally prohibits you from having, once you learn more information, from deviating from the initial recommendations for your final recommendations. So I understand it's a tight timeline, and I think legally speaking, if you end up with a different place with your final than you did with the original, that there could be some flexibility there.
And I also will just thank you for throwing out some initial ideas of where the focus and the priority is. What we have tried to do internally is make sure that the actual emergency piece of the response of public health is met, and I will call it the enhancement piece by the other departments is separated, so that you could make that decision to say, look, we want Metro to be able to pay our public health officials and pay the extra temporary labor, and those things are included in not only the $16.7 million that has been approved, but also the additional $32 million. That is our estimate through December 30th for our public response, and that's those critical needs. What I would call enhanced ability is in the other buckets that could be decided on much later. I will also say Ashley is working on looking at this, the state and how do we convey to the governor the needs that Metro has that far exceed what might have seemed like a lot of money at $121 million. You can now see is not really enough for our public response, particularly for our community. So we are working on that, and thank you, Representative Love, for pointing that out. And Metro is pursuing that.
When this committee was put together in June-ish, we weren't contemplating the deadline going from December 30th through September of 21, and I don't think we were contemplating perhaps additional revenue coming from the state.
Correct.
If they were to happen, we won't know until mid-August probably, with our deadline being August 3rd, and we can make a recommendation and alter it. If we do meet once a week, and at least through that point, we'll know a lot more. Mm-hmm. Right now we're playing with a pool of X dollars, but it could be 3X at that point. So offer a recommendation. We can make a recommendation that move from that. Can we just move the recommendation date until we know more, until August 15th at least, or I'm not sure exact date of the legislation?
The problem is that the recommendation date is set out by ordinance, which would take a council vote to change. So you're stuck with the August 3rd date at this point, pending some council action.
But let me ask, go ahead.
I was going to say, but we can go move somewhat softly on that date of what the recommendation is then. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the important flexibility is that initial recommendation isn't defined by some specific amount going. I mean, it's not defined, so that's your flexibility. The date is not where it's flexible.
Right. I think what you might be asking, I don't want to put words in your mouth, is could the recommendation be to come back in 2 weeks.
Those were the best words ever put in my mouth.
Yeah, I mean, it's not defined. I can't answer that other than to say that it's initial recommendations by August 3rd, so.
Okay, so it may be that you all want to do something immediate, or that you want to say, we don't want to do anything immediate, so, yeah.
For me? Okay, thank you. Well, one thing I see where Sean's going. I think I'll echo what everyone said before me, but I think it would be really interesting to know. I think you made a good point here of how you've already kind of broken out what the current expenditures are as well as the additional expenditures. And as I speak to what Councilwoman Sepulveda said, I think it would be good to have an understanding, not just from the department heads or whoever in the department put these together, but if there is any perceived overlap, right? So you're giving us what your estimated cost would be, and I would assume these are the departments who are already performing these things. So I would like to know if there's any potential overlap between what we're looking at in these number groups. I also would like to agree with Councilwoman Johnston. I think priority should be placed on individuals and businesses. I'm more of a proponent that a recommendation on August 3rd should be our desire to set aside particularly a small amount of money, whatever it may be, that shows that we're committed to small businesses and individuals. And then there's a large pot of money that probably won't go far enough anyway, that if we're meeting once a week, I would like to be able to have the ability to make recommendations almost on a weekly basis. I think, being able to be responsive and reactive is what we're going to need to be as a city and as a group of people. So I think that would be my approach. I think, the amount of information that I got since the last time I sat here is almost overwhelming. So I think being able to meet and react and be able to have the ability, or at least understand what our ability is in terms of making those recommendations, would be important.
Excellent.
One thought that occurs to me is, one thing we could do as a recommendation is we have costs that I guess council's already appropriated to cover emergency expenses that we know exist. We could recommend that and put our initial recommendation that we recommend appropriating money towards those funds. That we also recommend that we, set money aside to meet some urgent needs, and that we find a way to meet those needs according to an expedited time table. And I, can't even begin to imagine, when you're thinking about providing financial and rent assistance. One thing that I think we're charged to do as a committee is to make sure this money goes to meet needs created by the coronavirus pandemic. So making sure that the appropriate filters are in place to ensure that money is covering needs created by the pandemic. But then also, seems to me that maybe the initial recommendations say, that the balance of the money go towards these other kind of big guideline principal areas, and that we'll, figuring out the details of those.
Got it. Just a follow-up. So you're saying that we should recommend the 16.7, correct?
That has already been approved by council.
That was
Yes, ma'am.
So technically, 43.5 out of 121 has already been approved. So we're really dealing with 77.5
Correct.
million.
You're exactly correct.
Thank you.
So when we're looking at $77 million left out of this $121.1 million, and we see the additional infrastructure, which, what did you call it, Mary Jo? You had a word for it, and it was really good.
Oh, the
enhancements.
Enhancing the public response?
Well, just the additional infrastructure of the $65.2 million. In my opinion, that's way too much as far as that, when we've got these other categories that I feel like in a lot of ways are way more important. So as far as an initial recommendation, if we could just figure out, okay, how much money are we going to put into this category of reinforcing the infrastructure of Nashville and Suquamish? How much are we going to put into this supporting of health and economic of welfare? And I would love to be able to vote and get something. I don't think it's going to happen for the August 3rd council meeting, but I would love to get something on the August 17th council meeting to allocate funds specifically for small business and individuals. And then later on, we can figure out let's go through all of this and see what's, what's something that we can agree with that is reasonable.
I think I see a lot of nodding heads, so I think if you want,
I say let's start throwing out some numbers. Yeah.
Hey, one thing I
That's
do
a
wanna
motion
mention-
or whatever.
Can I back you up on this? One thing I do want to mention, the state has allocated $16.8 million so far for small businesses that just went out last week. And Representative Love can probably speak more to that, but that money just went out last week, just so you know, as far as the small business part of how much will actually be in Davidson County.
So I do want to ask this question as we're talking about recommendations. I think the other important question is, after recommendations are made, what's the timeline for distribution? Because we can allocate $20 million for rent relief and small business, but if it doesn't go out till October, to the United Way's point, then you got folks being evicted in September. Right. So I think if someone can provide us an answer on, what's the timeline after we make recommendations.
So our council members, and Alex can help me, will know this, that if your recommendation includes the name of an organization and we take that to council, once they approve that, the contract process can go pretty quickly. And depending on the specificity of that funds, they would be allocated as you requested, as council approves.
I would like to follow up on that and just wanted to see if we could have some requirements with that money, if we use, be it United Way or if we give it to the nonprofit specifically. I think there needs to be some guidelines, such as making sure that they report back to us how those funds were used. I also want to make sure that they're not asking people for social security numbers, because I had to personally call 4 of the nonprofits to make sure that that wasn't on their form, even though it wasn't required. That also hinders people from actually applying. So I don't know if we could have that as a requirement for however we allocate this money.
I think so, yeah. That is exactly what the proposal, from you is intended to be, is, kind of the how much money did you want it segregated to certain zip codes, certain industries, certain, funding requirements of rent, food, utilities, childcare. If you picked those specifics, you have the ability to set those parameters, and then also the administration. So you as the committee could see every application, you all could review them, you could select an administrator. I see somebody shaking their heads. You could select an administrator, which seems to be the most efficient, who is already set up to do that type of administration of the funding. And I know with the nonprofits, you can put a designation. You can say it's for this type of expenditure. You can say it's for this group. So you have that ability as a committee.
So I'm not clear. I hear that we keep moving toward the nonprofits, but there were several questions about agencies within the government that already provide these funds. And what would it take to expand their capacity to do it? And would that be quicker, or, do we have any numbers on what the city has done so far in terms of its own agencies and distributing?
So the primary agency that has received funding, and I don't think they've actually received the money. I don't think the deposits have been made, is our Metro Action Commission. They have received funding in the areas of Head Start. The Community Solutions Block Grant is the rent and utility assistance that Erica mentioned. And there will be funding for energy assistance for low income housing. And they have not even received that award yet. They expect to receive it.
So they have not distributed any funds to this point?
Correct. So I think what you're asking is, would that be faster? I don't think that adds any efficiency at this point.
And then there's the issue that Erica pointed out, that some individuals have, because of their distrust of the government, have not accessed the government agencies as well as they may do some of the nonprofits that are working in the community. So in my opinion, it would be good to diversify, not have one agency do all of it, but work with nonprofits and others as well. I have a question of the categories for our initial recommendation for August 3rd. Are we working within the categories on this response? Are we, is it our charge to come up with our own categories? Because I notice in the Metro response categories, there is rent and mortgage assistance and energy assistance, and those things are not included in the health and economic welfare of individuals. So I'm just wondering, where do we put that category?
That would fall in there.
Okay. Okay. So when we look at the sole dollar amount that we want, that we think we should allocate to that category, those
And I
would
think
be
the
in there.
idea of the interim proposal is perhaps to have some immediate funding that you all decide to put out, and as stated, come back each week and make additional decisions as information comes to light. And as you also have the time to go through the variety of requests.
Mary Jo, just to follow up on Erica's point about the nonprofit funding from the state, if you look at the 3 grand divisions, we're likely going to get $50 million if they divide it up evenly. And so it is next week that we'll know who the big distributors are, so you can kind of see what areas that they're going to be funding to, which will be helpful for you guys to know. So in the spirit of not doubling up where you don't need to, you'll at least have that information.
A question about that. I think both with nonprofits and small businesses, I mean, they're essentially entities of the state, right? So they have a conduit and a path to access state funding fairly easily, air quotes. But I think in terms of residents, they're local residents, and so I feel like our focus should really try to be there when we start to allocate whatever resources, especially if we do them on the front end. I feel like that's going to be a challenge for people to navigate, especially when you're trying to get individuals to gather a lot of information, understand how the process and procedures will work. And I feel like I know that our goal here is to provide financial oversight, but I wonder, and I know this is public information, but I wonder, can we also advise on information distribution, right? So things that may not cost money, but I mean, I feel like it would be worthwhile for the mayor's office to put out a statement that says our committee is geared toward and at least committed to providing some type of rental and financial assistance. So eviction notice, if you would make a stay of those for 15 days, because we have a dedicated group of people that want to put dollars towards that. We don't know what that is yet. I mean, can we advise in that as well? I don't know if that's crossing a line, I guess is the question.
I don't think it is. I think that can be a request and that's presented, to the council.
Okay, I was just curious. I think that would be something that's also, I would like the committee to think about. If we're not putting a specific dollar number to anything, and we want to appropriately so take more time to digest information and make recommendations, I feel like it would be in our best interest to make even non-dollar related advisory motions and or recommendations.
I think that's a great idea, basically to say, hey, we've got some relief coming, hold off on your eviction notices at this point. I think that's a great idea. The other thing that I would say is that one of the bigger problems that we have is not just the availability of assistance, but the communication of where to go, because people a lot of times have absolutely no idea. And so I think it may be easier. You shook your head on, we don't want to be reviewing applications. Like, I don't think that that's what this committee wants to take on. And so when we're contracting with whomever, it would be, I think it would be easier if it all went to one. And that way it's not, okay, well, if you're looking for rent assistance, go to United Way. If you're looking for food assistance, go over here. If you're looking for this, no. Go to one spot. And that way, all of the communication that comes from council members, from this committee, from the administration, from that partner themselves can be all the same message. Go to XYZ organization, period. So that, and you may disagree with me, but I'm wondering, I want to have a very centralized place for them to go that's very clear cut. This is where you go.
August 3rd is Monday, and so we have to have something sort of concrete, not in terms of specifics, but at least in terms of where we're going. And so I don't know if what we're talking about is some sort of guiding principles type of document, even if it doesn't have specific allocations. But I do think we need to do something that expresses sort of our values and priorities about what we think is most important in this process. And I know that you've listed this here, and it's not real clear, whether it's in any particular order, but I think that, this desire to get money out as expeditiously as possible to help people in need, I think is something that's a recurring theme that we're all saying. And so I do think that needs to be emphasized in terms of our commitment. And obviously, we want to consider these other categories as well. But we will learn more based on what happens with nonprofits. For instance, if rent relief was our top priority universally, we could find out that a significant amount of money is going to rent relief from the state funds, and it might change whether something else maybe got a little bit bigger. So I do think that passage of time in that sense can be helpful to us, but I think we need to have a strong statement on Monday of what our real values are here. I think right now we haven't really got that quite yet with this particular document.
I have a question, but I'm going to let Representative Love.
To the point about rent relief, I think the young lady from United Way mentioned that MDHA is going to start receiving applications sometime soon. I think that what we can do is consistent with what everyone is saying, is a statement about the city's commitment to rent relief goes a long way. It does not negate nonprofit organizations from applying to MDHA to facilitate those grants. It does not negate nonprofits applying to the state to be part of the $150 million to do the same thing. It doesn't negate any of that. I think it helps, because then what it does allows us to come back and evaluate after the August 3rd date to see who has applied where. But at least the city will say, Metro Nashville is committed to keeping our residents in their homes, and we have recommended that we're going to set aside X amount of dollars for rent relief with these requirements, that you not collect Social Security numbers, that you also do this. And then what it also does, it helps small business segment that is providing rent facilities to say, if you are a landlord and you've been holding out your eviction notices and you've been suffering, some money's coming your way eventually, because you're going to get paid from the CARES Act money. Now it allows us to then also contact MDHA and figure out who is also providing rent relief, and they may have applied with the state, they may apply with MDHA, and help facilitate the process. It's okay, now if you've done all that, then it may actually free up another organization to apply or distribute the money to another entity for rent relief. I think if we can nail that down today, we can go with the recommendation, and understanding that we will also have two other buckets, MDHA and maybe even THDA, but also the state with nonprofits that may apply for other funds. Let me ask this question, if I can, about the Equity Alliance report. Is their report and their research designed to lead up to them also requesting funds?
I don't know that I would say it was designed, but it does not preclude.
Okay.
So they would be eligible to apply for funds based on the work that they see that needs to be done. If they're able to meet those needs, I suspect they will apply.
Okay.
Whether that's from the state, from this funding, if it's made available, however you all decide.
Okay. All right.
But they are not precluded because of their work.
All right. Thank you.
So I've heard a couple things, and I remember I am not a voting member. I simply want to help facilitate, which is there an amount that you all want to make a recommendation in the August 3rd, or is there more a recommendation of these are the categories we want to prioritize, and we'll come back to you?
I think the goal is to get the money out as soon as possible. So I would be happy with a specific amount recommendation. That way we could actually get it on the council agenda so we could vote on it and get it out sooner rather than later.
I second. And I would like to say, because just to clarify, if we make whatever recommendation we make today, we can always come back and expand that or decrease it if we find out that we're getting more money from the state. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, it just says recommendation, so I would think as long as you justify the change in the final from what was in the initial, then I think you're not necessarily bound strictly to those initial recommendations.
And I think possibly maybe thinking of a partial recommendation rather than initial, that might be splitting, hairs in verbiage, but I think that's maybe what I hear you all are comfortable with. Again, doing my best not to put words in anybody's mouth, but you may say, I want some of this to go out. I want to make the initial recommendation is not for the full spending plan, and I'm going to come back and change that plan. The initial piece may just be that you want to put a dollar amount into council's hands immediately, and each week we might put in more, and and that might be part of that. That's, I think, the vagueness in the ordinance allows for that. So maybe initial sounded like you had to have the whole plan and it was a draft. Think of it more as a partial recommendation that we can go along as this committee continues to meet.
A little confused about the appropriation process because I'm hearing that we want to get this to council as quickly as possible. I presume so council can appropriate funds. So then to Councilwoman Gamble's question, if council appropriates funds, then you can't go back and decrease that amount. You can augment it, but you can't decrease it. Do I understand that right?
Correct.
So we've got $77 million left that we can spend. There's 32.1 that is sort of earmarked for additional expenditures that are estimated through December 30th for Metro's response. So that leaves $44.9 million to go through, our infrastructure, business stuff, our individual health and economic welfare support, the additional infrastructure that people have sent their requests in for. I would like to at least get, just to start off with, if we could get it on the agenda for Tuesday's meeting, to give $5 million toward economic welfare for individuals, for rent relief, utility support, food support. I liked how the United Way, I like that they've already done it, and I like that was what their goal was, is let's just keep people in their houses. I think that's, as far as an initial response, if we're going to try to get something out the door right now, I think that's a great way to do it. And then at least $2.5 million to go initially to our small business support for whatever it is that they, whatever that process is going to be. I would love to add to that later on, but I think just an initial, let's get this out the door, let's get this moving, I think is a good start. So $5 million and $2.5 million. But I'm open for,
Representative Love?
Just last week, my church and I were blessed to put $30,000 on electric bills for some people in North Nashville. And that only covered 71 people. And that's just electricity. So my concern is that if we do 5 for utilities and rent and economic, the number needs to be higher, at least 10.
I agree. I'm just saying to his point.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. I'm just saying to his point, we can always add to it later.
Sure.
But let's just get something out the door. But I'm happy to increase that number if that's what this committee wants to do,
I think out the door needs to be at least 10.
Oh, that's what I have initially wrote down, and I was trying to be conservative so nobody would freak out on me.
No. I think there's also a message sent, because if you can say at least 10, then that gets close to 10% of the entire amount awarded.
Yep.
And so you can say that the city's put at least close to 10% of the entire receipt toward the people of Nashville directly being impacted with rent, utilities, and some economic stimulus.
Yes, I agree. Like I said, that was what I initially wrote down. I just got a little nervous that everybody would freak out that I was going to try to
But thank you for that
get
recommendation.
15 million out the
Sure.
door.
I agree, and I would just like to add some context to that. From some preliminary research from MAC, 25 million would serve about 41,000 households. That's at 80% of median household income with rent relief. So that we can get some figures on how much that 10 million would possibly serve with maybe an allocation of $600 or $1,000 or something like that. So I agree, the $10 million is probably closer to that initial injection that we need. And if we look at what MDHA and MAC are doing, they have 5 million, so that's actually 15 million that would be going towards rent and mortgage relief initially. So I like the $10 million number, and I
I'm
second
going to
that.
rely on Alex, but I think we need an official motion.
Yeah,
if we-
I'd like to move to add an allocation of $10 million to individual support for however we want to allocate it. If we want to, you know, I think I would like to look at the United Way on how they did that since they've already done it, and look at what they've done and what worked, and maybe they've got some guidance on some changes to be made. But I'd like to move to allocate $10 million towards supporting the health and economic welfare of individuals.
I have a point of order. Just a quick question. Because you're just talking about the 10 million, not the 2 million for small business, correct? Okay. And I would like to amend that a bit.
Can we get a second on that motion before we amend it?
Second.
I'd like to amend it to give it to United Way with the requirement that they report back to us the nonprofits that are receiving these funds, the number of people helped with, and also that it is a requirement that they do not ask for Social Security number from any applicants.
Councilmember Johnson, do you accept that as a friendly amendment, or do you want to have it stand on its own?
It's friendly.
So can we get a second for that?
We heard today, in terms of the priorities of those surveyed by the Equity Alliance, it was rent relief, but it was also food and utilities. And I feel like that food is something, and the United Way specifically said that the first priorities when this pandemic struck was to try to keep people in their homes and to allow them to have utilities and to have nourishment. And I think that we need to make sure that's part of the priorities as well.
Do you accept that as a friendly amendment? Okay, someone second that, please.
Second.
Representative Love?
Thank you. Now we're discussing, let me make sure I got this right. The allocation will go to United Way to be the administrator of a grant for smaller nonprofits, or just directly to individuals?
Would rather it go to individuals. I think the more people we've got it passing through, the more room for missing funds.
Sure.
Right, so their process will be within their financial assistance network. It's between 6 and 9, I think Erica said there's some new ones, but those are the ones that are using Charity Tracker. So you have a little bit of you don't get duplication of effort by having that 6 to 9 groups. And so they will distribute the financial assistance. United Way would administer it.
So if I can, one of the issues that we are faced with as a city and a state and a nation when it comes to CARES Act is, as I think outlined in this report from Equity Alliance, all too often what happens is, even in crises and not in crises, whenever it comes to doing government by proxy, the same players always get the distribution. It's not any knock against United Way, it's just that they always get. The COVID response fund, literally, was administered by United Way. Much of what we're doing now is also trying to send a message, right, that we are equitable and that we are fair and that we're going to make sure that everybody doesn't have to keep going to the same place. I think just as much as there's distrust of government, I'm not sure how this sends a message to those hotspot communities that if United Way gets the 10 million, then will there be a second round? If there's not a second round, then what you have is the preferred nonprofit always gets the preferred treatment, even when it comes to when we have evidence that there's some organizations out here who could be doing the work. And so I just want to put that out there as we talk about, since we know that there are communities out there doing the work, and I don't want to belabor the process and have it go through several hands. I don't want it to have be a situation where Equity Alliance and United Way and Urban League and other organizations and Turk and other places don't work together. But I think we need to consider that also that, that there needs to be a conversation. What does it look like to have Metro Council vote this? Because I think, and you all could be wrong, Metro Council, if this goes to Metro Council, I'm sure there will be some conversation on the council floor about how did United Way end up once again getting this allocation when you have organizations out there who might have the cultural competency to handle this thing. Look at what Community Foundation did first week of tornado relief. They were intentional to make sure that organizations that were in the community and were trusted by North Nashville specifically got funds because they knew that folks would trust us more. I was late coming today because I'm dealing with a man on 16th Avenue who's trying to rebuild his house. But the only person who knew to call was Reverend Love to come down there and see if he could, because he doesn't trust other organizations who got money. And some who came by with the promise of helping and then said, well, we can't help you. If you make your square footage smaller, we can help you. So I want to avoid this conversation because I want to avoid the conversation that you all are going to have anyway, if we can kind of get this thing worked on this end right here. Because I won't be here when you all have this long debate till 5 in the morning.
I know. Lucky you, right?
Right.
I totally understand what you're saying, and I'm not stuck with United Way either. The reason why they popped up, obviously they were here, but they've already done this in this particular situation with this COVID-19 response. They have the charity tracker. We're able to keep, they have the ability to do that, and maybe Community Foundation has that same capability of reporting. I'm not exactly sure. I'm open to other organizations doing this. I just want to make sure that when we do this, that it's just the one, because I do think that there's power in having the communication power and saying, this is where you go, rent relief, food, utilities, whatever it is, this is where you go, because that's a huge issue, is just being able to communicate. Where do people go? I don't know where to go. I don't know what,
Mm-hmm.
So, but I totally agree with that. So if we want to talk about who is going to be administering this and in charge of that, absolutely. Like I said, I'm not stuck on United Way at all. That was just the reason why. It was because it was like we could just plug that into their already set up system, basically.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in the interest of time, because we want to make this expediently as possible, because United Way is already set up, I would recommend that for this first 10 million that we stick with that. I understand and appreciate what Representative Love is saying about the Community Foundation and other foundations that do work in the community, particularly with the Community Foundation. I was kind of apprehensive about them handling the tornado relief funding because I was worried that it wouldn't get turned around into the community as fast as it needed to be, but they changed some of their internal systems so that they could get it out fast. So I know that there are other organizations that maybe can do that maybe aren't doing it right now in the fast way that we need them to, but maybe could do it later. Whereas right now, today, we know that United Way can turn this around two nonprofits that can get it into individuals' hands quickly. So I would, for right now anyway, I'm okay with United Way, and I wouldn't have any problem explaining that if it became a discussion in the council.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem we would see probably on the council floor is that we haven't had the data from United Way. And since we haven't had the data, it's just like a black hole. We're giving them money and we don't know who's getting it, how much they're getting it. I mean, we had the what you gave us at our first meeting, and council members aren't aware of all of that. So if we had that and we made that a requirement, and we required them to also tell us how this 10 million would be distributed with all the background information, then I think it would be an easier lift, at least this first time around, and then we could revisit who we want to use next time if we decide to go with someone else.
And I know that there's a motion on the floor, but the $5 million that we discussed earlier that's already with Metro Action, that has not been, they've not been a recipient of those funds to this point. Is that correct? Do I understand that correctly?
Correct. They've been awarded but have not received, and it was the Community Solutions Block Grant for $1.8 million.
Okay, so it's
The
not
other
five.
amount is
Okay.
at MDHA, and that is HUD funding, and that has not, it has been awarded to MDHA, but it hasn't been awarded yet to the nonprofits who will be distributing it.
Is there a reason why those funds, that 1.8 just hasn't moved yet? I mean, is there reason for concern as to why we wouldn't have entrusted that organization to distribute those funds already?
Oh, they just haven't been received yet, because they're coming down from the state level.
Okay, so that's not part of these funds at all, even at 1 point. Okay.
It is not.
So I'm seeing both sides, I guess, of the argument here around utilizing United Way. I feel like more stipulations and more information should be a requirement. I don't know that they have had to do that. So I would hate to put it on them that they haven't provided it if we haven't clearly and expressly said that is a requirement, and we expect you to deliver that. So I think that is one thing that can go in that direction. I also think that I hate to say it this way because I understand the efficiency, but if United Way has only a small cauldron of 6 to 9 groups that they're only going to work with, I do think that is an exclusionary practice, especially if there are nonprofits or other organizations, even churches that are in these communities that should be able to go to United Way. And I think if there's a protocol for which United Way says, if you can meet this information, you can bring to us an address, a person, whatever it is that the protocol is. I mean, there are people who do it way better than I can explain it right here, right now, that they should not be precluded from having access to United Way. I think that's one thing that we should work to instill, that United Way is a partner.
And you all have
anyone.
the authority as part of the grant to United Way to request, that it be open, to all 501c3s. I mean, it doesn't have to go through their financial assistance network. As you saw from the list that was provided at it wasn't their final funding, but they funded many more nonprofits. They were just saying most of the financial dollars go because of the charity tracker, but that's not a requirement. And you all could direct that.
So I think I may have a solution to this, that the money go to United Way, but they use the data from the Equity Alliance, our fair share report, because that's being collected real time right now to inform them on who may need this assistance. And it also allow them to have the conversation with other organizations about how the processes can work. And I'll use a term we use up the hill, that they strive to work with other nonprofits and organizations to equally distribute the process. I mean, if they have a system that works, yes, we don't want them to not be able to use that system. And so if the experts at the distribution, all we're saying is that the information, unlike what you said, which is, nothing precludes an organization from saying, hey, I got 12 folks that you may not know. because you just can't get to them, and then here's the information right here, their name and phone number, call them. But unless I think we put that that in there that says we want you to also consider what is being reported, because I think the report will be when Equity Alliance back by that time, by August sometime, and so this will better inform what the real needs are of the community. So.
Do we have the process of application that the United Way used in that first round of 5.1 so that we can more clearly understand what their process is, what their, how you meet the requirement to receive this aid? How, do they just give you a check and, oh, my utilities are $100, or do they pay it directly to NES type thing? What is their process so that we can feel better about awarding this money to them for this this distribution? Do we have that information, and can we get it quickly?
I don't have it. I know we can get it quickly. Their application process was all online. I actually tried to pull the application, but the last one was not the one that they had used for the whole process. But we can get that from them. And the method of distribution is, I am familiar with their financial assistance network, and oftentimes what it looks like is you can go to the nonprofit and they will say, here's my bill, and they pay it directly to the utility provider, or here is my rent, and they pay it directly to the landlord. Sometimes it is a cash check, or not cash, but a check written to the individual. But oftentimes it is actually payment directly to the provider, either the landlord or the utility company. But there's some variances in that.
Yeah. Okay, so in the interest of time, like we're saying, we're all wanting to get this money out there as quickly as possible. Could we get United Way to give us a brief synopsis of their process, of their application process, and out of the $5.1 million, who received that, and the demographics of those people that received any portion of the $5.1 million? If we could get that by later this afternoon, I mean, if they've got Charity Tracker, it seems to me it'd be pretty easy to knock out a report. Get that emailed to us so that we can have, everyone can feel better, hopefully. Hopefully the information comes back and makes us feel better, so that we can get this resolution drafted, and so that we can get it on the floor for Tuesday.
If you want to wait to get that information before you vote, you need to have another assembly to do that, which could be done virtually on Monday if you all wanted to do that. It's normally the rule of thumb for notice is at least 48 hours. I think if you noticed it today for a Monday meeting to have a final vote, you could do that if you wanted.
On the assumption that we're going to get information that makes everyone feel better, can we go ahead and draft the resolution, and if we get information that's contrary to that, we can pull it?
Yeah, you could have one member of your task force could work with the moderators to draft that. You can't have two because you'd have to have open meetings. But you all could vote today to have one of your membership work with the moderators to draft a resolution, and then that could be presented Monday to vote on.
Okay, I'll volunteer to do that. If anybody wants to do that, it's fine, but I'm happy to work with whomever.
So since I believe that the motion is still active, are we still conducting parliamentary procedure on the motion that's on the floor?
I mean, Councilmember Johnson, you may want to withdraw that motion for this other part, but there is still a motion on the floor that needs to be addressed.
I like the way that it's going. I actually would like to make another amendment intended to be friendly, but I think it would, if United Way is to be the intended organization to receive these funds and allocate and distribute them, I would like to make it, as Representative Love said, inclusive, that they strive to work with other organizations in communities that have been highlighted in the Equity Alliance's report to us as presented today. And then that they also, once presented information, they would commit someone to come to our meetings. For $10 million, I think that's not a significant ask, someone to come to our meetings, but we can actually walk through their process, have conversations about it, and hopefully encourage them to further carry out what the intent of our motion is.
I'll accept that.
Okay, it sounds like, just to be clear, I don't think you want to, your original motion was to actually allocate the money.
Right.
Whereas now it sounds like you're going to do that motion on Monday. So I think right now you're looking for, I would recommend withdrawing your motion and then just it being understood that it be incorporated in the resolution that will be voted on Monday. I guess my concern is that if you vote on this motion, you have voted as a committee to allocate that money.
Have we not agreed to allocate the money, though?
I think that's what we want to do.
Okay, as long as you're comfortable doing that here.
Yeah, I'm comfortable allocating the money. I think we just want to have some stipulations on how it's allocated, a really hefty reporting feature on how they are allocating, and to make sure that they are as inclusive as they possibly can be based off of the recommendations from the Equity Alliance. And I'm happy to put that into that resolution. Is that agreeable?
I think that's where we are because it is consistent with us needing to make a recommendation by August the 3rd also.
Correct.
And so this is our recommendation that X amount of dollars goes toward United Way and also your 2.5 for business, for other piece. And so that's.
Are we adding the 2.5 to this, or do we don't want to just stick with the 10 million for the individuals and deal with
10 individuals, yeah.
10, okay, so we'll deal with business in a different resolution? Okay.
Yes.
So you'll say subject to final language from the resolution on Monday's meeting?
Correct.
Councilmember Spalding?
I think we were waiting on the business side to see what the state had coming down the pipeline specifically, so we don't duplicate that. So that was my only, I forgot where I was.
Now that we've clarified that motion, can we get a second to that motion? Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, was there a second motion? Or you were talking about the original motion?
This is all in the original motion as restated.
Yeah.
I had a question for purposes of discussion. We've talked about encouraging United Way to be inclusive in who it works with. And one suggestion might be that if we're giving them $10 million, that, and I hope I understand how their system works, maybe, $5 million of it could be used in their existing financial network, and the other 5 or some percentage we could require that they use, maybe nonprofits that aren't part of their financial network, assuming that those nonprofits have the capacity to administer. That might be a way to hit communities that that they wouldn't traditionally hit.
Well, yeah, I think one of the benefits that smaller nonprofits are going to have in even having a conversation with Equity Alliance and United Way and Urban League and other organizations, they all started small, but because they were able to work with a large organization, got the track record. And so this will allow, even in a conversation with a nonprofit that may have one employee, to have the conversation. They may not, they won't get any funding, or may not, but they're going to be able to have the conversation, engage with United Way, and may have never engaged them before, but they can bring to them a clientele that may have been forgotten about because United Way didn't have the reach into that community. So this will help us also build capacity for our smaller nonprofits because they will be participating, at least in the conversation with United Way, about how to reach these most vulnerable communities.
Thank you. While we're talking about the motion for individual rent and mortgage assistance, is it also our goal today to put dollar amounts in those other categories that we talked about for the August 3rd recommendation?
Which other categories?
Whether it's
All under individual.
reinforcing the infrastructure, supporting schools, emergency response. For the August 3rd recommendation, are we looking to put a dollar amount, nothing concrete, but a recommended dollar amount?
It's not required.
Okay, it's not required, okay. So all we need to do, we don't have to have a recommended amount for each category today, just what we want to recommend on the 3rd. Okay.
Correct. Are you ready to? Sean, did you?
I think we were going to wait on that to hear back from the department specifically. But I wanted to make sure that in our resolution, we included why we were only allocating this amount right now. so that we don't go back to council and they're like, well, you guys have met and you guys are only allocating 10 million right now. But if we make it clear that we are waiting on more information from specific departments, so we don't look like we're not doing our job.
We're going to refer to it as the initial recommendation.
Absolutely.
How things get portrayed in a resolution for approval, but it seems to me that some statement of our priorities, and it can be categorically these things in our guiding principles, we need to confirm those. I guess not so much with the bullets that are underneath here that have blanks, but just the broad principles. Although I would say that health and safety for our citizens, I think it should be broader than that. Economic security, not just health and safety, that could be read a bit narrowly. But I think, we say our broad principles, which are, 4 or 5 bullet points, and then we say that because of the urgency of the need to address issues, of health, safety, and economic security for our citizens, we want to make an initial allocation of $10 million because of the urgency of the relief needed, and then make it clear that we'll be coming back, with more detail on the others. But just however we phrase it, I think it's got to be in that broader context, but also the specific allocation is just a start.
Great.
Thank you. I think, I just want to make sure that the sentiment of the committee is that we don't want to make a recommendation on small businesses today as well, since we do have some data from the Our Fair Share, and we know that small businesses, particularly minority businesses that weren't able to get assistance through the PPP program and other federal programs, I myself would like to make a motion that we do add, like we're doing with the individual rent mortgage assistance, a small allocation towards the small business relief. I'm not sure which organization we would depend on to administer that, but since we do have some data and there is a need, I don't want to wait too long to come back with that recommendation. So I guess I want to hear the committee's sentiment on that.
So I think my understanding was that, correct me if I'm wrong, we could make a recommendation that these are the areas we want to fund, but not put a dollar amount in them and come back and put a dollar amount in them later on. We chose specifically to put a dollar amount in rent, but we still have the option to come back later on with a dollar amount for small business. Was that what was said early on? We had to make a recommendation of categories, at least, and in there was small business also. And if it wasn't, we can put that in there, but the only dollar amount that we included was the rent relief and utilities and economic security, because we did have some information about maybe the state bringing more money to small business, but we want to include the term small business, but not allocate a dollar amount today to it, because we can't take back out once we put in, correct? Dollar amounts.
Correct.
Correct.
That was my understanding. Do you want to answer that?
But are you making a separate motion? That's
Just like mortgage, we're putting in a dollar amount that's not nearly probably where it needs to be, but it's in a starting point until we can get more data and evaluate if and when more money needs to go in. I'm suggesting that for business relief as well. A small business relief, particularly, like I said, according to the data that we have so far that demonstrates the need, particularly in the minority community where there was not relief from the initial federal programs that were available.
Can I also suggest perhaps, because right now the current motion is about the individual's bucket, could we hold that motion until we concluded that part?
Are we ready to vote on the individual? Perfect.
Fine question before we get to the vote point. If you look at the Equity Alliance report, it talks about mortgage and rent relief. We've been talking about rent relief, but I do think that's a distinction we need to be clear about in whatever we approve, because those are two different things, obviously.
Yeah, and I would say that would be, when I say rent relief, I'm meaning rent and mortgage relief for individuals, yeah. And so we can clarify that in the language.
Yeah, I think we've got written down mortgage, rent, food, utilities. I think you've got all of that, right?
Okay, yep.
And one thing to clarify on the motion, because at one point there was a talk of one member working with the staff. Is that part of your motion to volunteer to do that?
Sure, unless anybody's object. Everybody's like, no. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. That's fine with me.
Okay, so just so I can restate it, so all this $10 million to supporting individuals bucket, subject to final language for a vote on Monday, including that Councilmember Johnson will work with the moderators on specific language, and it'll be voted on Monday, and then all the other parts of the motion.
Correct.
And we're ready for a vote.
Awesome.
And I think we said we can do show of hands? Yep. All right. All in favor? Raise hand. I count all 9 hands. Thank you all. Anything else?
Next order of business.
Next order of business.
And that we, and based on the information received in the Our Fair Share Equity Alliance study, as well as information from the chambers about the need for small business support, some preliminary data suggests that $10 million would support, with the allocation of $2,500 per 4,000 businesses, would support 4,000 businesses. So what I would like to motion today is that we put $5 million towards supporting small businesses employing 5 to 20 employees, particularly minority businesses that did not receive support from the PPP program or any other federal programs, that we allocate $5 million towards those businesses to be distributed by organizations such as the Nashville Business Incubation Center and the Chamber of Commerce, Nashville Chamber of Commerce.
I'll second the motion so that we can discuss it. My question would be, so the state is going to be allocating small business funding, correct? Or support?
They've already done so.
They've already done so. And
Yeah.
so we
So
just don't know
Davidson-
how much we're
No,
getting.
I do. So
Oh.
Davidson County got 16.8 million, went to 1,800 businesses, almost 1,900. We don't have the comprehensive list because some of those businesses are headquarters that are based here. So like they may have plants or other employees in other counties. But as far as Davidson County, 16.8 million went here. So that went out last week. And I'm going to let Representative Love speak a little bit more.
And just a suggestion, I understand your motion because there were a lot of businesses that opened up in January, and because they had not been open in December, they did not pay taxes in April, and they didn't qualify for the state plan that covered 28,000 businesses of the 200 million we allocated. What my concern and caution would be is that I think part of what I'm bringing to this committee is some inside information to help us not spend Nashville money if we can spend the state's money. And so what I would suggest is that we include small businesses in the recommendation, but that we don't put a dollar amount on it yet. We have a meeting on August the 3rd for the state. Let me push the agenda then to help exactly what you're talking about, and then get the state to cover that money for Nashville so we can spend this $2 or $5 million some other place, but we still put in the recommendation that we will allocate that, because we'll still have time to come back next week and put that into a dollar amount if we aren't able to get any money from the state.
So you're recommending that we, I guess, announce more so than a resolution or a recommendation, pretty much announce that we are also intending to make a recommendation for small businesses within the next week or two.
Sure, because I think it's consistent even with the comments about departments, right? That let's just see what department's going to bring back before we allocate a dollar amount, but let's recommend that we will support an allocation for departments. We will support an allocation for small business, but don't put it out. And I'm using the language you all gave me, which was, if we allocate a dollar amount, then you can't take it back out. You can always add to. And I'd hate for us to have a situation where if we allocate $2.5 million from the city and we found later on that we could have had the state cover those same businesses, then that's $2.5 million we could have put toward something else. Primary example is, it was great what we did with the $24 million for schools. There was no way that Metro would have known that a month later the state would say, we got a match program, right? We're putting $50 million in there, but it allows now MNPS to stretch to $24 million. But that's a prime example of, in this changing environment, you can't take back the 24. You can't say, oh, well, since the state's giving 50, we're going to now give 20 million to our schools, because that's bad. And so I'm just suggesting that we just wait a week, but recommend that we are going to help small businesses and detail the ones you're talking about, the ones who couldn't get PPE, the ones who couldn't get EIDL, the ones who opened up in January and could not qualify for the state's program, and say, these are the small businesses we're trying to get help to. We're not going to attach a dollar amount to it yet, but we are seeing your need and we're going to help you.
Okay. I mean, I would be agreeable to that. I just don't want it to be, take longer than, because they are already, kind of suffering and been waiting. And so as long as we can keep it within the week and two time frame, then I think that would work.
You pointed at me, but Representative Love got to my point, just to make sure that we place a focus on the businesses that have been and may likely continue to be excluded from any type of state funding program.
Go ahead. So, for those who didn't hear, the motion withdrawn, and we can put verbiage in the resolution that, I think I also have the comments that, we'll have the, whereas the committee believes this, whereas the committee wants to do this, whereas. So those will be kind of the statements of principle that come through a resolution. And then it can also include, the intent to support small businesses, but without a dollar. Does that help?
And clarification of small business, are we using a small business, or is it a classification? The reason I ask is when you look within the breakout that we have from small businesses, restaurant industry, music venues, there's one more, well, then the chamber's recommendations.
Yeah.
There's some overlay in all of those.
Great question.
So I think from the proclamation standpoint, we should leave ourselves open enough to say, in future meetings, we will further consider the support of either capital S or small s, and then break out, some of those specifically. And you mentioned the departments, and almost like the rest, we almost list.
I think I hear we want to maintain that flexibility, so small.
That's what my goal is,
S.
correct.
Okay.
Am I understanding that there will be a follow-up to what we have done today on Monday before going to council, and then we're going to have a subsequent weekly meeting, perhaps next Thursday?
Okay, so as far as, Alex, we can have a virtual meeting on Monday if we set up a WebEx. Do we need to pick a time? And at that point, we would have the resolution drafted for review, for vote? Okay.
As early as you can get it out would be best, obviously.
If we could do that virtual meeting on Monday before 3 o'clock, because we've got committee things that I like to listen to, budget and finance and public works and all that. So just if we could get this done before that time period, that'd be super helpful.
I mean, do we want to go, 10 o'clock, 10:30?
I got staff meeting at 10, but noon seems to work for everyone. Is that still the case?
We do noon? Okay. Yes, so noon Monday, and then we'll continue with the same noon on Thursday, and do we want to turn that to weekly? I see one no.
Conflict on Thursday until 1 Central.
I was getting ready to ask that question. Is that exclusive to just this Thursday that you have a conflict?
Just the 6th?
Okay, I can push to 1.
Okay, so we will
This
do
particular Thursday.
August 6th, 1 Central, but then we should probably just put the recurring then for each Thursday, and is noon preferable on a recurring basis? Okay.
Thank you for that accommodation.
Okay, is there any business that I've left off? Any final? Representative Love? We did. Your hand was up.
Not the individual, I mean the general recommendation.
The general one will be in the resolution. I think what I heard is that we would kind of do some whereas this is the intention of the committee, and whereas this is where our priorities are, but whereas the emergency is today, and that will be why we have the $1 recommendation. Does that work? That's what we expect you to all see Monday. All right, we'll get together. Thank you all. We are officially adjourned. I appreciate your extra time on top of your busy schedules. Thank you so much.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.